The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34-18. Welcome to God's Word in the Clouds Radio. Wherever you're listening from tonight, your living room, your car, your porch, or the quiet corner of a room you don't usually sit in, thank you for being here. Not because you need to listen, not because you have to, but because something in you decided you didn't want to end this day alone. This radio is not a place for perfect faith. It's not a place for polished words. And it's definitely not a place where anyone is expected to hold themselves together. It's a place where you can breathe with the truth of where you are, even if that truth is messy, even if it's unresolved, even if you haven't spoken it out loud to anyone yet. Every night, we share one story. Not miracles. Not grand testimonies. Just the honest journey of one person who carried something heavy for too long and eventually found God. Not in the loud moments, but in the ordinary hours where life feels too much and hope feels too small. Tonight's story is about a woman named Claire. She's 45. She's been divorced for 3 years. She's raising her son alone. She works, she drives, she pays bills, she makes dinner. And somewhere between all of that, she tries to remember the version of herself that existed before exhaustion became the background noise of her life. Her story isn't tragic. It's human. And that's exactly why it matters. A lot of people break loudly, but even more people crumble quietly, not because they're weak, but because they don't have the time or the space to fall apart. Claire is one of those people. And if you've ever gone through a season where you kept going because you had no other choice, you might find parts of yourself in her journey. Before we begin, I want to tell you something simple. You don't have to agree with everything in this story. You don't have to feel anything specific. You don't have to force yourself into some emotional moment. Just listen. Let the story unfold, the way real life does. Slowly, honestly, without rushing toward a conclusion. Tonight, you and I are going to walk with Claire into some of the quietest corners of her life. Corners she avoided. Corners she survived. Corners where she eventually learned that God doesn't leave people just because they're tired. If you're ready, we'll begin. Claire lived in a neighborhood where every house looked calm from the outside. Wide lawns, trimmed hedges, tidy porches. But anyone who has lived long enough knows that quiet neighborhoods often hold the loudest private battles. She had moved there after the divorce, not because she loved it, but because it was the only place with rent she could handle, and a school she trusted for her son Michael. Michael was 12. He had his father's eyes, but his mother's tendency to hide his feelings behind a polite, well-behaved exterior. He wasn't troublesome. He wasn't difficult. He just carried things quietly. And Claire recognized that trait, because she lived with it too. Her life wasn't messy from the outside. She woke at 6, made breakfast, packed Michael's lunch, drove him to school, worked 8 hours at a dental clinic, picked him up, made dinner, helped with homework, washed dishes, prepared for the next day. There were days she wondered whether routine was saving her or draining her. The divorce hadn't been violent. It wasn't explosive. It was what people call amicable, a word that sounds gentle, but hides a lot of unspoken grief. Her husband left not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't love her enough to stay through the hard seasons. And that truth, that soft, quiet truth, cut her deeper than any loud betrayal could have. The hardest part of the divorce wasn't the paperwork. It wasn't the meetings. It wasn't the slow, polite unraveling of two people who had stopped loving each other the way they once did. The hardest part was the silence afterward. Silence in the kitchen where 2 coffee mugs used to sit. Silence in the living room where arguments once lived. Arguments she would have gladly taken back if it meant still having someone to come home to. At the end of a draining day, people think heartbreak is loud. In Claire's case, it wasn't. It was the absence of noise, the empty chair across from her, the feeling that she now had to be both mother and father, while also trying not to fall apart in front of her son. For the first few months after the divorce, she kept telling herself she was doing fine. She paid the bills. She kept the house intact. She maintained routines so Michael wouldn't feel the tremors. She tried to hide, Convincing others she was okay was easy. Convincing herself was harder. She found a rhythm eventually, the kind a person builds when they no longer have the luxury of breaking down. But deep down, she knew she was building her life, on top of a grief she hadn't processed yet. One evening after work, she picked up Michael from school, and immediately noticed something different. He was quieter than usual, not sulking, not upset, just withdrawn in a way she recognized, because it mirrored something inside her. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" she asked, as they buckled their seatbelts. He nodded, and that was all he said. They drove home with the radio low. Not music, just static, just background noise, to keep her from hearing her own thoughts too clearly. At dinner, Michael barely touched his food. Claire watched him, and a familiar worry settled in her chest, the kind she'd carried since the day she realized her son would grow up with a story she never wanted for him. After they cleaned up, Michael went to his room. Claire stood in the hallway and wondered whether to knock or give him space. She decided to knock. When she opened the door, he was sitting at his desk, pretending to do homework, but not writing anything. "Mom," he said quietly, as if the word itself was a confession. "What's going on?" she asked, taking a seat on the edge of his bed. He didn't look at her at first. He traced circles on the page with his pencil, a small, nervous motion that reminded Claire of how he used to draw shapes when he was overwhelmed as a toddler. "Dad forgot to call me yesterday," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact that carried a deeper hurt. Claire felt something in her chest tighten. She opened her mouth, ready to defend, to soften, to explain, to step into a role she didn't want, but had learned to perform. But Michael continued quietly. "It's not that he forgot, it's that, I think he remembered, and it just wasn't important." Claire's heart broke, not loudly, but in the quiet way hearts break when they realize a child understands something they weren't meant to understand yet. She sat beside him in silence, not sure whether to hold him or apologize for something she never caused. Michael finally looked up at her. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired, a tiredness no 12-year-old should feel. "Is this my fault?" he asked. And that question, that simple question, cut deeper than anything her ex-husband had ever said or done. Claire didn't think, didn't breathe, didn't allow a single second to pass. "No," she said, firm but gentle. "None of this is your fault. Not one piece of it." Michael's lip trembled, just for a moment. Then he nodded, and leaned his head against her shoulder. It was the kind of moment that stays with a mother forever. A moment when she realizes her child is carrying a weight she wishes she could take from him, but can't. That night, after he fell asleep, Claire walked into the backyard. She didn't take her phone. She didn't take a jacket. She just needed air, the kind of air that feels different from what fills the rooms of a house that holds too many unspoken emotions. She stood there under the dim porch light, hands in her pockets, and for the first time in months, she spoke to God. Not because she felt spiritual, not because she had a habit of praying, but because she didn't know who else to talk to about the kind of fear that keeps mothers awake long after the world goes quiet. "Lord, I don't know what I'm supposed to do," she said softly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't even shaped like a prayer. It was the voice of a woman trying to hold her life together with hands that were growing tired. She felt nothing change in that moment. No warmth, no sign, no sudden comfort. But she stayed there anyway. Stayed because she needed to admit out loud what she had been carrying too quietly. "I don't want him to feel abandoned," she whispered. "I don't want him to blame himself. And I don't want to do this alone anymore." When she went back inside, she didn't feel fixed. But something in her felt a little less locked. And for a woman who'd learned to survive by burying emotion, that small shift mattered. Over the next few weeks, she started noticing subtle things about herself, things she had overlooked because she was too busy functioning. She noticed she avoided looking at photos from before the divorce, not because they hurt, but because they reminded her of a version of herself she no longer recognized. She noticed she hadn't bought anything for herself in months. Not clothes, not books, not a single item that wasn't essential for survival. She noticed that on days when Michael seemed fine, she felt guilty for still feeling lost. She noticed how tired she was, not from doing too much, but from carrying too much alone. And eventually, those small realizations led her to something she'd avoided, the possibility that she had not healed at all. She had simply survived too well. One Friday afternoon, after dropping Michael off at a friend's house, she parked in the driveway, but didn't get out. She sat there with the engine running, her hands resting on the steering wheel, and let a truth reach the surface. One she'd been pushing away, because she didn't want to confront it. I'm lonely, not for romance, not for marriage, not for someone to fill a role. She was lonely, for herself, for the parts of her she'd put away, in order to be strong enough to raise her son alone. It shocked her how much that realization hurt, but it was honest, and honesty, once acknowledged, doesn't fade easily. Loneliness has a way of sneaking into the spaces where a person believes they've already healed. That's what happened to Claire. She thought keeping a routine meant she was moving on. She thought paying bills on time, cooking meals, helping with homework, and keeping her voice steady meant she'd regained control. But sitting in the parked car that Friday afternoon, she realized routine had simply kept her distracted, not restored. For the first time in years, she let herself sit in the truth without resisting it. And the truth was simple. She wasn't fine. She was functioning. There's a big difference. She turned off the engine and stayed seated, her forehead resting lightly against the steering wheel, not crying, not panicking, just letting the weight she'd been pushing away finally settle where she could feel it. After a few minutes, she straightened up and stepped out of the car. She expected the feeling to fade once she walked into the house, once she entered the familiar routine that usually pushed her through the day. But it didn't fade. It followed her inside, like something she could no longer outrun. She dropped her purse on the kitchen counter and stood there with her hands braced on the edge, a posture she'd taken 100 times whenever she needed a moment to gather herself. This time, she didn't gather anything. She simply acknowledged what had been waiting. She missed being known, not in the romantic sense, but in the deeply human sense, the way people long to be seen, without having to explain themselves. She missed being asked how she was, by someone who genuinely wanted to know, and wasn't checking a box. She missed feeling like someone understood how hard she was trying, even when she didn't succeed. She missed being held accountable to a version of herself she hadn't had the energy to be. And as irrational as it felt, she missed having someone to lean against at the end of a draining day. Not because she needed saving, but because she was tired of carrying her entire world in both hands. Every single day. That evening, after reheating leftovers and eating dinner alone at the counter, she went to the living room and turned off the lights. She sat in the dark, not to hide, but because she didn't want anything around her to demand attention. And in the quiet, she spoke again to God, not from a place of desperation, but from exhaustion. Lord, she murmured, I don't know when I started disappearing from my own life, but I want to come back. I just don't know how. She expected nothing. She didn't look for a sign. She didn't wait for a feeling. Her prayer was simply the truest thing she had said all week. A few days later, something happened at work that forced her to confront herself again. She worked at the dental clinic's front desk. Most days were predictably appointments, insurance forms, rescheduling. But on this particular Tuesday, a woman around her age came in, with a little girl holding her hand. The girl was shy, and kept tugging at the woman's sleeve, as if the world was a little too big for her that morning. Claire smiled at her. The girl didn't smile back, but she inched closer to her mother, in a way that reminded Claire of Michael at that age. Sensitive, cautious, thoughtful. During check-in, the woman struggled to find her insurance card. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Claire immediately recognized. She'd seen it in the mirror. Take your time, Claire said softly. The woman looked up, and for a split second, their eyes met with a kind of silent understanding. Two mothers, two private battles, two lives stretched thin. After the appointment, the woman returned to the counter with her daughter. "Thank you for being patient," she said. Claire shook her head. "It's all right, really." But the woman hesitated, lingering as if she wanted to say more. "You look like you carry a lot," she finally said. It wasn't invasive. It wasn't judgmental. It was simply honest. The honesty of someone who had learned to recognize weight because she carried her own. Claire froze. No one had said anything like that to her in years. The woman continued, "I just wanted to say, you're doing better than you think." It wasn't what Claire expected, and it broke something open in her. Not painfully, but gently, as if a truth she'd been avoiding finally had permission to exist. That moment stayed with her, long after her shift ended. Driving home, she replayed the woman's words in her mind, again and again. Better than you think. She didn't know whether it was true, but she knew it was something she desperately needed to hear. When she pulled into her driveway, Michael wasn't home yet, still at a friend's house. She stepped inside and felt the house's silence settle around her in a way that didn't feel as heavy as it used to. Maybe because for the first time, she realized other people carried invisible weights too. And maybe that meant she wasn't failing as badly as she believed. Later that night, she sat on the edge of her bed, with her hands folded loosely in her lap, a position she often found herself in when she was tired, but didn't want to go to sleep yet. She spoke to God again, this time more quietly. "I don't need everything to be fixed. I just don't want to feel this alone." It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a demand. It was the most honest prayer she'd said since the divorce. And even though nothing in the room changed, something small shifted inside her, like a door had opened just a little wider than before. She didn't know where any of this was leading, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. Uncertainty meant she was moving again. Uncertainty meant she was waking up. Uncertainty meant she had not disappeared from her own life, and that was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A few days later, Claire found herself standing in the kitchen after work, staring at the sink full of dishes. It wasn't the mess that bothered her. It was the sudden wave of exhaustion that washed over her so intensely. She had to steady herself with one hand on the counter. She wasn't burned out from chores. She wasn't overwhelmed by work. It was deeper than that. A heaviness she'd carried for so long. She'd stopped recognizing it as something she wasn't meant to carry alone. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked to the living room. Without turning on the lights, she sat down on the couch, her body sinking into the cushions as if it had been waiting all day for her to finally stop pretending she was fine. The house was quiet. Michael was at an after-school program. She had at least 2 hours to herself, a rare stretch of time she rarely used for anything other than catching up on work or chores. Tonight, she didn't move. She didn't scroll her phone. She didn't think about dinner or tomorrow's tasks. She just sat there, letting silence fill the spaces she had kept crowded for too long. She leaned her head back and exhaled, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in months. A breath that felt like it came from somewhere older than stress, somewhere below survival mode. And in the quiet, without planning it, she started talking, not out loud, not in a formal prayer, just a quiet stream of honesty that rose naturally inside her. "I don't know who I am outside of responsibility anymore." It startled her a bit, not because the thought was new, but because she'd finally given it words. She continued, "I don't know if I'm doing enough for Michael. I don't know if I'm doing enough for myself. And I don't know how long I can keep going like this." She wasn't falling apart. She wasn't spiraling. She was simply letting truth exist, without rushing to push it back down. At some point, she lifted her eyes toward the ceiling, not searching for a sign, just needing to look somewhere. That wasn't the floor. "God, I don't need you to fix everything. I just need to know I'm not doing this alone." She didn't expect an answer, but the moment the words left her, something in her chest loosened, the same feeling she'd had in the backyard days earlier. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. She was tired of carrying life alone, when she was never meant to. That night, she slept better than she had in months. A week later, something unexpected happened. It was a Saturday morning, and Claire and Michael were at the grocery store. She pushed the cart slowly, reading labels out of habit, while Michael lingered near the cereal aisle. As she turned the corner, someone called her name, Claire. She looked up and saw an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years. Not because of conflict, but because life had pulled them into separate orbits. Her name was Hannah. Hannah had been there during the early years of Claire's marriage. The playdates, the dinners, the long talks over coffee. When life still felt full of possibility, they hugged briefly, and in that embrace, Claire felt a familiar warmth she didn't realize she'd missed. They talked in the aisle for almost 20 minutes. Nothing dramatic, updates about work, kids, little things they hadn't shared in too long. But then Hannah became quiet, looking at Claire with a softness that made Claire's defenses lower without her permission. "Are you doing okay?" Hannah asked. The kind of okay that wasn't about chores, or schedules, or responsibilities. The kind that meant, "How are you really?" Claire swallowed, not because she wanted to cry, but because she wasn't used to being seen that closely. "I'm trying," she said honestly. Hannah nodded, and in that small gesture, Claire felt a kind of comfort that therapy and prayer and routine hadn't been able to give her. Before leaving, Hannah touched her arm gently. "Don't disappear again, all right? You don't have to go through everything alone." Claire nodded, but something inside her whispered, "Maybe I don't." That evening, after Michael had gone to bed, Claire stepped outside again, not to run from anything, but to breathe in a moment that finally felt spacious. She looked at the sky, the faint stars, the quiet street, and something inside her settled, in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not because her life had changed, not because her circumstances were fixed, but because her heart had finally stopped, bracing for impact every day. She whispered softly, "Lord, I think I'm ready to live again. Just show me how." It wasn't an emotional breakthrough. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't any kind of cinematic turning point. It was the gentle realization that she didn't have to crawl through life anymore. She didn't have to apologize for needing support. She didn't have to earn peace by pretending she was stronger than she felt. She just needed to be willing to let God meet her where she actually was, not where she thought she should be by now. And for the first time in a long time, she believed he could. So that's Claire's story. Not a story about victory. Not a story about everything falling into place. It's the story of a woman who finally stopped moving long enough to hear the truth inside her, and discovered that God had been waiting in the quiet places she kept avoiding. If you're listening tonight, and you see pieces of yourself in her, in the heaviness, in the loneliness, in the quiet responsibilities that never end, I want you to know something. You're not behind. You're not failing. You're not supposed to carry everything on your own. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is admit you're tired, and let God sit with you in that tiredness. Before we end tonight, I want to pray with you. Lord, for every person listening who feels worn, who feels stretched thin, who feels unseen in the life they're trying so hard to hold together, meet them gently. Not with pressure, not with expectations, just with presence. Give them rest tonight. Give them clarity for tomorrow. And most of all, give them the quiet assurance that they do not walk alone. Amen. Thank you for joining me tonight on God's Word in the Clouds Radio. If this story touched you, if it helped you breathe a little deeper, or simply made you feel less alone, I invite you to subscribe so we can walk together every night. Rest well. God bless you, and I'll meet you again tomorrow. Same place, same quiet, same gentle space for your heart.